Welcome everyone to the second session of Enhancing Accessibility in Teaching and Learning series. This is a joint initiative hosted between the Center for Teaching Excellence and the Center for Extended Learning. My name is Christine Zaza and I'm an online learning consultant with the Center for Extended Learning. I use she and her pronouns. My collaborator and today's speaker is Victoria Feth, Educational Developer for Curriculum, Accessibility and Inclusion with the Center for Teaching Excellence. We'll start with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each of the sides of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. This territorial acknowledgement is a reminder that in Canada, Indigenous peoples experience disability at twice the national rate. It is also a reminder that to reflect on Indigenous worldviews that consider disability to be a Western construct associated with colonial practices. Those practices result in social oppression and they go against Indigenous perspectives that value community, where we all feel that we belong. At Waterloo, we strive to uphold the value that we all belong. And one way to do that is by increasing accessibility in everything we do. So we're grateful that you have taken the time to be here to learn more about accessibility in your teaching. This is the second of 4 sessions in this series, which focuses on enhancing accessibility in teaching and learning. A recording of the first session, Accessibility Basics, is available online. Today's session will be posted on CTE's YouTube channel and will be linked from the events page. The presentation will take approximately 30 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A period. If you have any needs or technical questions during the presentation, please use the chat or send me a private chat and I'll be happy to help. Today, Victoria is presenting on the topic of accessibility and teaching effectiveness. Go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you, Christine. I just want to make sure everybody can see my slides before I continue, or that my slides are up. Sarah has a hand up. We'll just check in with Sarah before we continue.
Oh, sorry, an error. Pardon me.
Oh, no worries. All right, great. Okay, thank you, Christine. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Victoria, and I'm the Educational Developer for Curriculum, Accessibility, and Inclusion at the Center for Teaching Excellence. My pronouns are she, her. I have chin-length dark and silver hair. Today, I'm wearing headphones and a black shirt with white flowers on it. My slides have a green line at the top and bottom of each slide with green triangles in the top left and bottom right, and you can download the slides from the chat. I'm presenting about accessibility and teaching effectiveness as part 2 of the Enhancing Accessibility in Teaching and Learning series. My intended learning outcome for you today is that by the end of this webinar, you should be able to understand accessible teaching and teaching effectiveness as integrated goals using the University of Waterloo's framework for teaching effectiveness. How did I come to research and present this topic? You may have heard of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. In 2022, a committee produced a report that proposed post-secondary education standards to be developed under the Act. Today, those standards have yet to be enacted. However, the University of Waterloo's proactive response was to put a project in the Teaching Innovation Incubator called the Accessible Education Project. As part of this project, I and others have been creating resources for extending and deepening accessible teaching practices. Understanding accessible teaching and teaching effectiveness as integrated goals is the result of some of that work. The framework for teaching effectiveness is a key piece of the holistic model of teaching effectiveness at the University of Waterloo. The framework has 4 building blocks, which are shown on the right side of this slide as interlocking blocks. The building blocks are design, implementation, learning experience, and professional development. The framework was designed to be flexible enough to accommodate changes to the landscape of teaching. So in creating resources to support accessible teaching, we saw an opportunity to use the framework to underscore that good teaching is accessible. I want to take a minute to explain this slide since you'll see a version of it for each building block of the framework. This is a snippet of the framework for teaching effectiveness shown as it is on the web page in a table with the building blocks across the top and the areas of focus under each building block. Here I've pulled out the building blocks and the areas of focus that correspond to the accessible teaching strategies I'll share on the following slide. There are many accessible teaching strategies that integrate with the framework, but today I'm sharing just a few by way of demonstration. On these slides, I also want to show how the building blocks are mutually reinforcing, meaning that areas of focus in one building block reinforce areas of focus in other building blocks. I've highlighted in purple the building block I'm currently talking about, which is design, and aligned it with another building block, which is implementation. This shows how trying any one strategy from this presentation can have a ripple effect on the accessibility of your teaching. The design building block area of focus is planning, specifically building your course around an evident design framework, clearly defining course level learning objectives, and setting workload and performance standards appropriate for the course level and topic. The implementation building block areas that reinforce design are communication, specifically describing and explaining material clearly, and assessments and feedback, specifically communicating clear expectations and instructions for assessments. Now let's see how accessible teaching practices and strategies integrate with these building blocks and areas of focus. The design building block is described in the framework as alignment at the planning level. Sorry, just lost my spot. An accessible teaching practice for design is the alignment of outcomes, assessment, and instruction. An accessible teaching strategy for alignment of outcomes, assessment, and instruction is writing and revising learning outcomes with accessibility in mind. And just to warn you, you're going to hear me say write and revise a lot in this presentation, since it's really about applying an accessibility lens to the great work you already do. Here are 2 questions you can ask yourself about your learning outcomes. So number 1, have you described the content, which is the knowledge, skills, and values students should achieve by the end of the course? Specifically, considering the amount. Is there too much or too little? And considering the ways of demonstrating content knowledge achievement. Are those the only ways, and must those ways be prescribed at all in the learning outcome? For example, you might include an essay in the learning outcome, but must content knowledge be demonstrated in an essay? Unless the essay format is the content knowledge, consider leaving that specific way out so that your learning activities and assessments can be open to more ways of demonstrating content knowledge. And number 2, have you described the level of achievement considering the course level? For example, is it a first year or fourth year course? The course type, is it compulsory or elective? And the course's position in the program or curriculum. Is it before or after certain other courses? In other words, what can you predict students already know coming into your course, or should they know leaving your course? So these 2 questions and sub-questions help ensure your intended learning outcomes are appropriate for the students in your course. When you design your course and start with your learning outcomes, meaning the content and level of achievement, you set up the design of the other components of your course, such as your learning activities, instructional methods, and assessments. Let's take a minute to situate implementation in the framework. So the implementation building block area of focus is assessments and feedback, specifically communicating clear expectations and instructions for assessments, providing performance feedback in a timely manner, and providing directions for student improvement individually or collectively. The design block area that reinforces implementation is framework and alignment, specifically developing appropriate and sufficient assessment methods that align with course objectives and outcomes. And the learning experience block area that reinforces implementation is engagement with learning, specifically fostering intrinsic motivation and providing evidence of student learning. Now let's see how accessible teaching practices and strategies integrate with these building blocks and areas of focus. Implementation is described in the framework as from design to action. An accessible teaching practice for implementation is clear assessment instructions. And an accessible teaching strategy for clear assessment instructions is to write or revise assessment instructions with accessibility in mind, which could look like any of the following. Contextualizing the assessment, for example, including a clear purpose for the assessment, connecting it explicitly and transparently to learning outcomes, and/or connecting it to related course materials. And depending on the assessment and level of students, you can also scaffold or guide students through this contextualization, such as asking them how the assessment relates to other course concepts. Another strategy is removing or explaining jargon and technical terms, ensuring that important jargon or technical terms are explained or have been explained before students encounter them in the assignment, or perhaps just that they know where to go and are reminded where to go to find those terms. Another strategy is breaking instructions into steps, which might be as straightforward as taking a paragraph chunk of text that you've already written for an assessment and breaking it out into bullet points, and maybe even using AI to accomplish this task swiftly. Another strategy is including a checklist, especially for multi-tiered assessments or assignments, to let students know what they need to do for each part of the assignment and empower them to track their own completion. And finally, but not exhaustively, planning for multimodal support, considering where or how else students will access the instructions, such as posting them in an accessible format on Learn, including a version of the instructions in a lecture video, or providing a short video or audio announcement, as well as perhaps handing them out in class on paper. And do note that not all of these strategies will make sense for every assessment. Your context and the resources available to you are important considerations here too. Now let's take a minute to situate learning experience in the framework. The learning experience building block areas of focus are responsiveness, specifically responding to student inquiries and questions in an appropriate time frame, and engagement with learning, specifically generating student interest and seeking student input on course learning experience. The design block area that reinforces learning experience is planning, specifically planning a variety of teaching and learning strategies to promote student engagement and deep learning. And the implementation block areas that reinforce learning experience are the promotion of student engagement, specifically using teaching and learning strategies that encourage student engagement and deep learning, and a variety of teaching strategies and practices, specifically adapting to evolving classroom contexts. And now let's see how accessible teaching practices and strategies integrate with these building blocks and areas of focus. The learning experience building block of the framework is described as student perceptions of their learning experience. One way to learn about what students think of their learning is to ask them. But we also need to think about the design of the learning experience in terms of how students might or might not experience those as accessible. An accessible teaching practice for learning experience is inclusive active learning. And an inclusive teaching strategy for inclusive active learning, an accessible teaching strategy for inclusive active learning is to write or revise active learning activities with accessibility in mind. 2 questions you can ask yourself about your active learning activities are, what senses or abilities does this activity require as designed? And 2, what other options for the way it's done are available? So for example, if an active learning activity requires mobility, such as students needing to get up and move around, consider having students stay seated in their groups and having the paper or project itself move around the room. Another consideration is the sense of sight, which is often highly privileged in higher education. A small change you can make is to describe what the slides look like, or what your slides look like, and what is in the images during a presentation, almost like providing aloud the alt text for the images that students will hopefully have access to if they have an electronic copy of your slideshow. Another accessible teaching practice for learning experience is feedback on accessibility. And 2 accessible teaching strategies for feedback on accessibility are to review your student course perception surveys with an accessibility lens, asking how accessibility needs might have influenced students' responses. For example, if a student mentions that they struggled in a particular area, consider whether that might have been because the design or implementation could have been more accessible. And 2, collect and respond to midterm feedback and include a question about accessibility, such as, how can I make this course more accessible for you? Ensure anonymous options for feedback and avoid disclosing student situations or needs, even if you're trying to be general by saying something like, a student in this class let me know that they have, you might inadvertently be disclosing that student's identity, even though you're not naming them. Great, we've made it to the last building block. So let's take a minute to situate professional development in the framework. The areas of focus for professional development encompass all the areas of focus in the rest of the framework, including design, implementation, and student experience. The areas of focus here are highlighted here are reflection, specifically reflecting on and assessing teaching and learning practices, and continuous improvement, specifically participating in professional development activities. So now let's see how professional development can support accessible teaching practices and strategies, and vice versa. Professional development is described in the framework as activities supporting growth as an instructor or supervisor. One accessible teaching practice for professional development is attending accessibility programming, which everyone here is already doing today. And a strategy to support this professional development is reflection and tracking or documentation, because there are a handful of reasons that collecting or curating evidence of changes to your courses may be beneficial. Now on this slide, I'm going to post some questions, and this is going to transition us into our discussion time. I will post the questions so that you can begin thinking about them, but also know that the discussion time is for you to bring up any of your questions and comments that you would like to share with either Christine or I, or any of the other folks here today. After I've read through the questions, Christine is going to, or she already has, dropped a document in the chat that is a list of strategies that I've shared in these slides. So you have that as a reference in case you do want to answer one of these questions by way of discussion. So the questions are, what strategy or strategies shared in this presentation have you tried and how did it go? What is one new strategy, either from this presentation or that this presentation made you think about, that you could try yourself? What is one new strategy you need help with? And from the new strategies that this presentation has made you think of, where do you see those as fitting into the framework for teaching effectiveness? So the slideshow also contains a resources slide, which I'll just show you so you know it's there. With links to support you in trying out some of the strategies shared here. You can always reach out to myself, Christine, your faculty liaison, or your OLC, depending on your course, the Agile Development Team at CEL. There are many people here who can support you in making your teaching more accessible. And so with that, I'm going to stop the recording so we can begin our discussion. And again, that is to invite you to share in response to any of these questions or bring up any of your own questions or reflections that you would like to share.